Hello, music appreciation students. This is your last lecture video for part one of your textbook. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about were the chapters 8 and 9, musical texture and musical form. Texture and form are related terms in that they kind of deal with how a piece of music is layered or created, or how it gets from one section to another. When we talk about musical texture, what we're talking about is if the melodies, the harmonies, and the rhythms of a piece of music were all characters in a story. Texture would be how those characters interact. When we start with musical texture in the Middle Ages, when we get into part two and we're talking about musical texture in the Middle Ages, we didn't deal with a lot of harmony. Everything was really melody driven, and we have what's known as monophonic or single sound texture. Monophonic texture deals with just a single musical line. Okay, there's no layering there. There's no additional instruments providing harmonies or chords. There's not two melodies set against each other. It's unaccompanied melody, and monophonic literally means one sound or single sound. As music progresses into the Renaissance, into the Baroque, and on, we start to get ideas of polyphonic texture. Poly meaning multiple, phonic meaning sounds, so multiple sounds. So we start to layer musical ideas, and we might have two or three different melodies that are going on at once. We might have a melody that is accompanied by chords. We might have equally important rhythms that are providing melodic or harmonic accompaniment. But polyphonic texture gives us two or more equally important musical lines acting simultaneously. And finally, within polyphonic texture, something that we're going to hear quite a bit, especially with things like the concerto, and orchestral music, especially homophonic textures, when we have one melody that has chordal accompaniment, not choral. I'm not talking about voices specifically here, chords that accompany a single melody, or when we have a melody line that is nothing but chords. And these ideas of texture in Western music, they don't necessarily correspond with the number of musicians. Okay, we can have monophonic texture in Gregorian chant that is being sung by 10, 15, 20 people, but they are all singing in unison, the same melodic line at the same rhythm at the same time. And so same with polyphonic texture. Even though we might have multiple musical lines going on at once, if you think about the instrument of a piano, we've got 88 keys on a piano with one person being able to play quite a lot at once. You know, we could have several melodies going on at once. We could have chords plus melody going on at the same time. So when we talk about texture, we're not necessarily talking about a number of people. Okay, it's not just one person on an instrument that creates monophonic texture, or multiple people like an orchestra or a band that creates polyphonic texture. What it actually deals with is the number of musical lines. Do we have musical lines that are layered one upon another, or do we have single musical lines that are happening one at a time? And within a piece of music, the texture can change. We can move from unison lines to harmonies. We can move from single melody to multiple melodies and things like that. And so that's what texture is. Now, when we talk about musical form is how we get from the beginning of a piece of music to the end of a piece of music. We're going to talk about a lot of different forms throughout, especially the Baroque and the Classical period, things like the fugue and the ritornello and theme and variations, the sonata form. All of those are how we reuse musical material, how we move from section A to section B to section C, and so on and so forth. And you can actually hear an easy example of musical form when you turn on the radio. Just about every type of music that you listen to on the radio is in a type of form known as verse-chorus form. And it's something that you're familiar with, where you have an opening verse, then you have a chorus with some kind of a hook with repeated lyrics. Then you might come into another verse, and in that next verse, the musical material will sound the same as the first verse, but the lyrics will probably be different. And then we come back to the chorus. So we've had verse, chorus, verse, chorus. Then sometimes we have a bridge with new musical material before ending with another chorus or another verse. And this is a type of form. It's how we get sequentially from point A to point B to point C to point end, whatever the end of the piece is. And when we talk about musical forms in part 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and I know that seems daunting when we think about it over the next 16 weeks, but all of these forms, they really just correspond to how we're getting from the beginning of a piece to the end of a piece. Texture is how we're layering up pieces of the melodies and the harmonies and things like that. So that sort of gives you an idea of how to differentiate between texture and form. And again, this is your last lecture video for for part 1. You'll have a couple more for part 2 when we get into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance.